If you ever happen to find yourself at one of the evening cocktail receptions hosted in conjunction with the annual conference of the German Studies Association, you might stumble upon a group of North American scholars discussing Niklas Luhmann. Chances are the topic will not be the reality of the mass media, or literature as a self-organizing system, or the relation between form and medium, but rather Niklas Luhmann as phenomenon, and more precisely, why he has failed to achieve the same status in North America as he has in Germany. As William Rasch has recently put it, quote, "The importance of his work is recognized, but it has never caught fire," end quote. This and other similar observations, which have been made with some frequency over the course of the past 2 decades, provided the original inspiration for the larger project that Nico Pettisch and I are pursuing under the auspices of the Auerbach Fellowship. The project has 2 goals. The first is to reconstruct Luhmann's impact on North American scholarship, and especially on the work of humanities scholars, with the aim of developing a robust conceptual framework for thinking about cross-cultural transfer of theory in general. The second is to make the case for a renewed engagement with Luhmann's work among North American literary scholars in particular, by pointing out specific features of systems theory that are especially relevant to current areas of interest. Initial efforts to introduce Luhmann to a North American audience occurred largely in the context of debates about post-structuralism and postmodernism, and they no longer reflect either the concerns of contemporary scholars or the current state of systems theoretical literary study in Germany. To put it provocatively, it may be the case that an adequate North American reception of Germany's last grand theorist has only become possible after theory. This evening, I'd like to offer some preliminary reflections on the topic, presented with an eye toward generating a discussion that will be helpful as we move forward with the project. None of the claims I make is intended to be definitive. What I'm giving you is more or less a roadmap of my own thought process as I immersed myself in the Luhmann phenomenon over the past few months. And in fact, rather than a single overarching narrative, my remarks will constitute something more like 3 mini presentations of increasing length, which can be categorized according to 3 basic questions. The first is whether there is actually anything that needs explaining here. That is to say, whether Luhmann's reception in North America does indeed represent some kind of anomaly. Assuming that the first question is answered affirmatively, then the second question pertains to reasons. How might we explain this fact? And finally, the third question is why we should care, or to put it less flippantly, whether there are in fact features of Luhmann's grand theory that deserve the attention of literary scholars in a post-theoretical era. What does it mean to claim, as Rasch does, that Luhmann's work has never caught fire in North America? The implication is that there is something unique about the reception of Luhmann's thought outside of Germany, that it has been less enthusiastic than one would expect. One can easily find other statements along these lines, and I want to say at the outset that I think this assessment is generally correct. Nonetheless, it is simply a hypothesis, and treating it as such allows us to reflect on a host of questions related to how we understand and measure intellectual influence. To insist on the uniqueness of Luhmann's reception is to attribute it the status of something along the lines of a special path, or Sonderweg, with all of the complexities that adhere to that status. Special in comparison to what? What is the standard against which the singularity of Luhmann is being evaluated? Are we comparing him to Habermas or Hans Blumenberg, 2 other German thinkers with dramatically different reception histories? What about Reinhard Koselleck, Arnold Gehlen, or Friedrich Kittler, or for that matter, Derrida and Lacan? With regard to Luhmann, the first and rather obvious thing to note is that assertions of neglect begin with a distinction. The claim is not that Luhmann has been underappreciated in general. It is rather that a notable asymmetry exists between his stature in Germany, where he has even been referred to as, quote, der größte Soziologe der Nachkriegszeit, it's from Die Welt in 2008, and his stature in other parts of the world. But are we sure of this? For one thing, influence is geographically heterogeneous. Luhmann's impact in North America is not identical to his impact in Latin America or Eastern Europe. For another, influence can take many forms. We might consider the number of Luhmann's works that have been translated, or the number of prominent representatives of systems theory in another country, or the number of times his work has been cited. Regarding this latter measure, an entire field known as bibliometrics has emerged in the past few decades with the aim of establishing the influence of individual scholars or specific publications in these terms. Many of you have probably heard of such measures as impact factor and H-index that use citation counts to quantify intellectual impact. And if you visit the Scopus website, you can quickly establish that Luhmann has an H-index of 16, meaning that he has 16 publications that have been cited by others at least 16 times. By way of comparison, his longtime adversary Habermas has an H-index of 29, and the physicist Richard Feynman has an H-index of 42. There are so many flaws built into these metrics that it would take the entire evening to go through them. Moreover, to the extent that such measures are based on an international academic publishing context, they fail to capture the distinction between Germany and the rest of the world that concerns us here. But the basic assumption that citation histories offer a way to measure influence strikes me as fundamentally sound and worth pursuing with more nuanced tools. Another version of this approach, one that is also flawed, but nonetheless does provide a perspective on the asymmetry in reception, is offered by Google's Ngram viewer. Most of you are probably familiar with this tool, as well as with its shortcomings and the naive claims that it has occasionally been used to support. I think this negative reputation is somewhat undeserved, however, and as long as one remains aware of the limitations of the underlying data, it can provide a helpful means of orientation. I'm not sure how well you can see that, but these two images depict the frequency with which the names listed appear in the Google Books database for German and English language publications between 1980 and 2000. The databases contain books scanned primarily from the collections of major research universities, as well as the catalogs of some US and UK publishers. Comparing the graphs reveals several interesting discrepancies between the German and the English collections. But the most significant one in the current context is the dramatic difference in the relative frequency with which Luhmann's name appears in the two language corpora. So in German, you have Adorno, Habermas, and Luhmann together, relatively high up. And in English, it's Habermas, Lacan, and Adorno sort of occupy that same position. I'm sorry, I can't enlarge it. Okay, however, although it is plausible to interpret this difference as an indication of asymmetrical reception, the Google Ngram approach forces us to confront a second key challenge related to the question of measuring impact. Which Luhmann are we talking about? The graphs include any reference to the name Luhmann in any work in the database. But the focus of our interest is more specific, and it presupposes a domestic theory transfer that is prior to any migration of theoretical paradigms across the Atlantic. Our more precise question has less to do with Luhmann in general than with the emergence of a systems theoretically informed literary studies in Germany and the degree to which these approaches have been adopted or have co-evolved among North American colleagues. We thus find ourselves having to map more specific disciplinary communications circuits for which the evidence is sparser and more anecdotal, but also arguably more compelling. A quick review of Amazon.de reveals virtually all of the recent handbooks on literary theory published in German contain a section on systems theoretical approaches, including recent volumes by Oliver Simons, Klaas Morgenroth, Tilman Köppe und Simone Winko, and Achim Geisenhanslicke. Luhmann also features as one of the 18 thinkers considered to be, quote, a Klassiker der modernen Literaturtheorie, by the editors of the volume of the same name published by Beck in 2010. In contrast, he is nowhere to be found in the 2006 Routledge Guide to 50 Key Literary Theorists and the 2,800-page third edition of the Norton Anthology of Theory and Criticism, which includes 191 contributions from 157 authors, couldn't find space for Luhmann either. On the other hand, in the 2012 publication of his famous lectures on the theory of literature, Yale scholar Paul Fry does mention Luhmann, a grand total of 1 time, and it is in the preface and in parentheses. We could also review syllabi or citation counts in literary journals in particular for additional information. But even on the basis of the above evidence alone, it seems that in the case of literary studies, we really do face a puzzle, one that raises important questions about the factors driving the circulation of ideas. Is Luhmann's asymmetric reception a sui generis phenomenon, or is he representative of a class? Are there other examples of thinkers from other countries whose domestic influence so dramatically outstrips their international impact, at least with regard to a particular facet of their thought? And if so, might we be able to identify a set of features, whether linguistic, conceptual, institutional, or more broadly cultural and historical, that can help us explain this asymmetry? To address the first question would take us too far afield, but in the second section of my presentation, I would like to offer some reflections on the more specific question of why Luhmann in particular might have been received with skepticism or indifference in North American academic circles. I am by no means the first to consider this topic. Although to my knowledge, no specific hypotheses have been formulated regarding systems theory in North American literary and cultural studies, possible explanations for an alleged general indifference to Luhmann abound, many of which are entirely plausible. The broader insight regarding theory transfer that can be gleaned from this embarrassment of riches is that the answer to the question of why theories circulate is highly overdetermined. With this in mind, it may be helpful to categorize possible answers in terms of levels of focalization, which is to say whether they emphasize factors intrinsic to the theory or the thinker in question, or disciplinary and institutional frameworks, or broader intellectual historical contexts. In Luhmann's case, some have pointed to the inherent difficulty of systems theory, and especially to the uniquely abstract quality of his texts. But this feature does not explain cross-cultural differences in reception, at least not unless one can also explain the apparently unique affinity of German readers for such abstraction. And anyway, as others have also argued, are Luhmann's texts really more difficult than those of, say, Derrida or Lacan? Explanations that address more disciplinary and institutional factors have focused on the absence of high-profile, charismatic mediators or mediator translators capable of playing a role similar to that of Spivak in the case of Derrida, or on the precarious status of German departments at North American universities, since these departments have been the most frequent channels for the introduction of Luhmann's thought. In terms of intellectual historical shifts, and turning our attention to the field of literary and cultural studies in particular, one might also point out the relatively late appearance of the influential monograph Die Kunst der Gesellschaft, which was published in Germany in 1997 and in translation only in 2000, by which point the humanities in North America had arguably entered a post-theoretical era. The term post-theory was certainly in circulation by that point, and disciplinary debates no longer seemed dominated to the same degree by an elite group of master thinkers, which is undeniably how Luhmann was presented by his early North American advocates. One final possibility is worth mentioning, one that anticipates the discussion of digital humanities, to which I will return in my conclusion. In his pioneering essay on distant reading of 2000, Franco Moretti writes, quote, "The United States is the country of close reading, so I don't expect this idea to be particularly popular," end quote. Moretti is certainly right about the North American predilection for close reading. And on its face, like distant reading, systems theory lends itself far more readily to the sociological analysis of literary history and literary institutions than to finely grained interpretations of literary works. This has no doubt also played a role in its limited impact. Any assumed tension between systems theory and close reading requires qualification, however, since one of the major recent developments of systems theoretical literary studies in Germany has been a more selective appropriation of specific features of Luhmann's thought for precisely such interpretations. As Niklas Webber explains, quote, "Fest steht, dass eine Vielzahl von systemtheoretischen Bauteilen aus der Soziologie Luhmanns herausgelöst und in diverse literaturwissenschaftliche Projekte eingelassen worden sind." In other words, German scholars now treat systems theory less as an integrated whole to be adopted in toto than as a conceptual toolkit that contains specific instruments suited to the completion of specific tasks. As I mentioned, virtually all of the explanations offered are plausible, and those of you present tonight can no doubt come up with additional factors that will seem equally reasonable. Without denying this general point, I want to turn now to what I think is the most persuasive explanation for the relative lack of interest in Luhmann, especially if we take into account the productive disassembly of his theoretical edifice that I just described. This explanation is based on the fundamental criticism that has been leveled against Luhmann's work from the beginning, namely that it is insufficiently engagé. Habermas is, of course, the most famous advocate for this view, claiming that systems theory is ultimately little more than a theoretically sophisticated apology for the status quo, the quote, Hochform eines technokratischen Bewusstseins. Robert Hallub formulated a version of this criticism for North American readers in his contribution to the 1994 Luhmann special issue of New German Critique. Hallub writes that, quote, systems theory appears to have conquered literary scholars in Germany at a moment when they are most interested in science without ethics and meaning without politics. And he goes on to describe it as, quote, a fully academic discourse without social relevance, end quote, concluding with the assertion that, quote, if it is to escape the fate of academic sterility, it must find ways to go beyond observing and describing the social system of literature and begin to speak with partisanship about the social and political exigencies of Germany and Europe. Hallub's claim was fairly representative at the time, not in the sense that everyone would have agreed with his assessment of Luhmann, but in the sense that, quote, social and political exigencies served as the ultimate horizon for the evaluation of theoretical paradigms. Other contributors to the special issue, more sympathetic to systems theory, typically align it with deconstruction or postmodernism more generally. And in doing so, they tacitly or explicitly adopt the widespread assumption of the radicalism of these movements that was typical of North American advocates. The belief that the post-structuralist critique of the subject posed a much more fundamental challenge to social and political power structures than the neo-Enlightenment thought of Habermas. Indeed, it is worth pausing for a moment to consider the predominance of this alleged affinity between systems theory and deconstruction in North American efforts to promote Luhmann. Kerry Wolf, in one of the more significant recent attempts to explain the value of systems theory to an American audience, asserts that he wants to, quote, make clear to skeptics that much of what they like about deconstruction is also much of what they should like about systems theory. Wolf made this assertion in 2009, by which point establishing the connection to deconstruction was probably not the most effective way to encourage a renewed focus on Luhmann. But I mention this only in passing. The crucial point here is that Wolf believes the approaches of Luhmann and Derrida can be combined to provide a foundation for a new and genuine form of post-humanist thought, which, quote, has profound ethical implications for our relations to non-human forms of life, end quote. Among Luhmann's North American critics and defenders, then, the question of whether systems theory can be harnessed for some kind of politically or socially engaged criticism looms large. Of course, the ethical implications of systems theory have been a subject of debate in Germany as well. And Luhmann has been no less harshly criticized in his home country than elsewhere for his alleged failures in this arena. The difference is that these criticisms did not prevent his work from exercising a powerful influence on German literary and cultural studies, whereas I would argue that this has contributed to his limited reception in North America. From this perspective, the example of Luhmann allows us to pinpoint a significant institutional and disciplinary difference between Germany and North America, one that certainly deserves the attention of scholars in the history of science. This difference, which is to say the prominence of ethical considerations in North American discussions of theory and methods, has only become more pronounced since the 1990s. In this third and final section of my presentation, I want to briefly consider two case studies in order to argue that it is precisely with regard to these ethical commitments that a more substantial engagement with systems theory might prove productive. The fruitfulness of systems theory in this context, moreover, stems not from some hidden social critical potential that has been overlooked until now. This tends to be the point of view adopted by scholars advocating for what is called critical systems theory. I want to focus instead on those very features of Luhmann's work that have been the target of criticisms. His insistence on description rather than critique, and his belief in the value of submitting certain forms of discourse to a, quote, moralische Unterkühlung. The basic orientation I am advocating for here is captured in Luhmann's notion of an Abklärung der Aufklärung, which is to say the use of sociological theory to map the limits of the Enlightenment project rather than to attempt to advance it in the form of a critical theory of modernity. According to Luhmann, in a functionally differentiated society, there is no Olympian perspective available from which to develop normative categories with universal applicability. This is because society is constituted by a collection of autonomous functional systems that operate autopoietically, which is to say that their evolution, including their response to irritations from their environment, is determined by processes and structures internal to each system. What is possible, however, is a descriptive sociology of individual systems, one that sheds light on the rules and codes according to which they operate, and in doing so also provides a theoretical framework for comprehending what one commentator refers to as the, quote, unfasslichen Komplexität einer sozial kontingenten Welt. As I said, I want to elucidate my position on the basis of two case studies, but before turning to these, I also want to take a moment to clarify my intentions. My primary interest here is not to align myself with Luhmann at the level of specific opinions. In fact, I find some of his more sarcastic and dismissive remarks about ethics rather off-putting. On the contrary, I'm sympathetic to many of the ethical commitments of my North American colleagues, but I've often been struck by the disconnect between their ambitious claims and the amount of reflection devoted to the mechanisms through which those claims might actually be realized. Luhmann makes a similar observation in Die Gesellschaft der Gesellschaft. In his reflections on Irritationen und Werte, on his interpretation, the widespread recourse to universal ethical principles and values represents an attempt to escape the contingency that typifies every functional system in modern society, to establish a sphere of values characterized by absolute Unirritierbarkeit. But as he also explains, quote, bei einer soziologischen Analyse sieht man zusätzlich, dass es an jeder Vorsorge für die Umsetzung der unirritierbaren Postulate in soziale Realisation, ja selbst an einem Verständnis für dieses Problem fehlt. This crucial question of Umsetzung or implementation brings me to my first example, the so-called New Formalism in Literary Studies, a movement that took shape primarily among scholars in US English departments after 2000. It can be seen as a counter-reaction to the dominance of historicist approaches in criticism up to that point, especially in the form of New Historicism. As Marjorie Levinson explains in a seminal review essay of 2007, scholars working in this vein, including Ellen Rooney, William Keach, and Susan Wolfson, quote, aim to recover for teaching and scholarship in English some version of their traditional address to aesthetic form. The concern, one that was actually voiced well before New Historicism became the dominant paradigm in literary studies, is that an exaggerated emphasis on context leads to the neglect of those unique formal qualities that constitute the literariness of the literary text. At first glance, this appears to be a primarily cognitive claim about the essence of literature. We cannot fully grasp the nature of the literary text as an object of inquiry unless we attend to its form. But it will probably come as no surprise that advocates of the New Formalism cast this project in decidedly ethical terms. As Levinson sums up one strain of argument, quote, through its formal address, literature is said to solicit a set of responses that work to enhance and sustain our humanness. And she goes on to explain that in every one of the texts she has read, pragmatic concerns are uppermost in the minds of the authors. Quote, concerns about the state of our pedagogy, our scholarship, our literary inheritance, and our democratic institutions seem to be deprived of a crucial element in ethical subject formation by the transformation of literary studies into socio-historical study over the past 20 years, end quote. The idea that aesthetic experience can play a role in ethical subject formation has, of course, a long history and will be familiar to anyone who has read Schiller or Marcuse or any of their successors. It is an idea that remains plausible in principle, despite an equally long history of challenges to its validity, including challenges posed by the concrete course of history itself. And it is closely linked to another idea, which is that of aesthetic autonomy. The precise conceptions of aesthetic or literary autonomy that underlie the ethical aspirations of the new formalism are varied, but they nonetheless converge in the insistence on a special status for the literary work of art within the social totality, one that enables it to serve as a repository for certain kinds of experiences that cannot be obtained anywhere else. In some interpretations, these experiences are conceived in terms of certain unique forms of pleasure, whereas other interpretations emphasize a degree of richness and complexity of experience that challenges the one-dimensional, routinized experiential protocols of neoliberal modernity. Now, Luhmann would readily agree to claims of literary or aesthetic autonomy, but with one key clarification and one key qualification. The clarification is that from the perspective of systems theory, to invoke the autonomy of art is to refer to the operative autonomy of the art system as one of the many partial systems that constitute modern society. It has nothing to do with any unique quality that can be attributed to aesthetic experience or to the nature of the artwork. And the qualification follows from this, namely that there is nothing special about the autonomy of art. Operative autonomy is a more or less trivial consequence of functional differentiation. It means that the art system perpetuates itself according to its own specific code and program, that its evolution is always determined by its own internal rules of operation. But this is the case with all of the other functional systems as well, including politics, economics, science, and education. While the autonomy of the art system can be seen as trivial in one respect, however, the implications of this particular autonomy are anything but trivial for scholars dedicated to an ethically committed literary studies. While these scholars tend to focus on the autonomy of art as traditionally understood, they are in fact operating at the convergence of three autonomous systems: art, science, and education. Actually, there are four, but I'll bracket consciousness for the moment. What this means is that any ethical project entails questions of intersystem relations, the answers to which are extraordinarily complex. To make an assertion about ethical subject formation in an academic article is to engage in an active communication within the scientific system, which employs the code of true-false and will respond to this act according to its own laws of operation. If communication is successful, it will generate follow-up communication, Anschlusskommunikation, in the form of additional articles, conferences, or say a 10-page review essay in the March 2007 issue of the Publications of the Modern Language Association. Such follow-up communication might address the validity of the ethical claims made. Does attending to literary form really sustain our humanness? Or it might even reflect on how to implement a program of ethical literary studies in the university classroom. But all of this activity is entirely dependent of the two other functional systems. This does not mean that the systems themselves are entirely independent of one another. As Luhmann puts it, functional systems are autonomous but not autarkic. But they can only influence one another through irritation or perturbation. This means that a development in one system can impinge upon another system, but the response to any irritation always takes shape on the basis of the code and program of the irritated system. The cognitive claim that the close reading of literary texts can contribute to ethical subject formation is one thing. To foster ethical subject formation through the reading of literary texts is something very different. Applying a systems theoretical lens to the claims of the new formalists cannot help but give rise to an impression of disingenuousness, not because the claims are false, but because of what seems to be an utter lack of interest in Umsetzung or implementation. Given the prominence of ethical concerns in the argumentation, one would expect this interest to loom large in the scholarly discussions, but it does not. And to paraphrase Luhmann, there does not even seem to be a widespread recognition that this is a problem. Perhaps, however, we can still imagine the ethical goals being achieved even in the absence of any such discussion. In this scenario, acts of communication in the scientific system acquire, for reasons we would have to establish, such a degree of intensity that they become an irritation for the educational system. As Luhmann explains, the existence of this irritation may or may not lead to any structural changes in that system. In other words, a system can and often does respond to an irritation by ignoring it. But one can also imagine that this irritation is powerful enough to elicit structural adjustments, the nature of which are determined by the system, and in this case might involve new literature seminars, specifically addressing questions of form, or perhaps more time spent in the classroom engaged in the close reading of specific passages rather than in broad historical discussions. We are still a very long way away from ethical subject formation or enhanced humanity, however. And this brings me back to the previously mentioned fourth, and in some ways most crucial autonomous system involved in this complex web of intersystem relations, that of consciousness. The status of consciousness in Luhmann's canonical theoretical works is not a topic that lends itself to a brief elucidation. Thus, in order to highlight my main claim, I want to take a detour through a more concrete set of reflections, the transcript of a 1988 discussion in Bielefeld that took place in the context of the pedagogical reform effort Projekt Offene Schule. The remark that I find most relevant here occurs in response to a question about the, quote, Öffnung von Schule im Sinne von Zuwendung zu dem psychischen System. Luhmann's response is worth quoting in its entirety. Ich denke, das führt auf die Frage, wie weit die Pädagogik das Individuum ernst nimmt. Wenn sie es wirklich als empirisches Faktum ernst nimmt, psychologisch, tiefenpsychologisch, klinisch, therapeutisch oder was immer, dann ist ganz klar, dass dem Lehrer nur die Kommunikation mehr oder weniger zur Verfügung steht. Wenn nur die Kommunikation zur Verfügung steht und das eine ganz zeitraubende Sequenz ist, wie soll dann eigentlich irgendetwas von psychischer Komplexität in die Klassenkommunikation eingegeben werden? Schon emilische Systeme, also Rousseau, typische Erziehungsdiaden, sind ja extrem anspruchsvoll, schwierig, zeitraubend und nahezu exklusiv. The ethical aspirations of the new formalists can ultimately only be understood as a pedagogical project. It is, after all, virtually impossible to imagine these aspirations giving rise to an irritation that would significantly impact any functional system other than that of education, including that of art itself, notwithstanding the fact that this scholarship is ostensibly about artworks. As a pedagogical project, however, it must confront the fact that consciousness is a black box. Consciousness is also an autopoietic system that responds to irritations from the environment only in terms of its own laws of operation, which are entirely opaque. All the teachers have at their disposal is communication, and communication can never penetrate directly into consciousness. The situation is complicated enough in cases where only cognitive contents are being communicated. But it becomes utterly baffling when one considers the complex psychological processes that would be involved in a task such as fostering ethical subject formation. How could one possibly hope to implement a pedagogy in the university classroom that would facilitate such a goal? How would one even begin to measure success? Finally, as Luhmann remarks in the same interview, quote, alles was geschieht, geschieht auf Kosten von etwas anderem. In other words, the question also arises as to what is not being taught or learned as a consequence of what is. Contrary to appearances, I am not arguing here for the futility of an ethically committed scholarship. At an intuitive level, I continue to believe that reading literature and attending to its unique formal qualities can indeed play a role in ethical subject formation. But in light of the contingencies involved, the highly restricted affordances of the pedagogical situation, and the complexity of the psychic mechanisms that come into play in such a process, one would expect a more detailed consideration of how this is to occur. The problem is not a lack of critical perspectives, but what Luhmann refers to as a Beschreibungsdefizit. If one truly cares about ethics, it probably makes sense to focus less on theorizing the precise ethical potential of an engagement with aesthetic form, that is to say, theorizing the phenomenon of aesthetic autonomy, and more on developing the instruments of description that will allow us to grasp the operational autonomy of both art and literary studies. In the absence of such complex description, ethical commitments run the risk of serving a purely therapeutic function for the individual, or in the context of the scientific system, of serving only to generate the additional system-specific Anschlusskommunikation that facilitates autopoiesis. To anyone who finds the previous discussion disheartening, I would point out that the complexity and contingency just described have a silver lining, which also brings me to my second example. As I already alluded to in my reference to Moretti, it is quite striking to note the similarities between the criticisms leveled against systems theory in both Germany and North America, and some of the recent criticisms of developments in digital humanities and computational literary studies. The previously mentioned essay by Hallub offers a case in point, linking the adoption of systems theory by some German literary scholars in the 90s to a misguided enthusiasm for, quote, scientific rigor, end quote, that runs the risk of, quote, robbing literary scholarship of its diversity and interest, end quote. And regarding systems theory more generally, one can point to the frequent assertions that it reproduces in its diagnosis of modern society, and even in its very procedures and protocols, the technocratic consciousness of the post-war Bonn Republic. In a similar fashion, some critics of digital humanities insist on an ideological alignment between the computational study of literature and culture and neoliberal capitalism. As one commentator has summarized this claim, the, quote, refusal of interpretation is the key enabler of creeping university-based neoliberalism, in literary studies anyway. The phenomenon of operational autonomy, however, reveals the absurdity of such a broadly conceived symmetry, at least as far as it pertains to digital humanities research and teaching. And in fact, the institutional practices of digital humanists suggest that they have taken the lessons of functional differentiation to heart, albeit in a manner that raises its own set of questions. The ethical claims of digital humanities are actually more explicit and above all more direct than those of the new formalists. And in this regard, the field can be seen as a paradigmatic counterpart to the new formalism in terms of the ethics of scholarship. In the preface to the 2019 edition of Debates in Digital Humanities, for example, the editors pose the following question, quote, what is the role of digital humanities in the charged environment of 2019, and how can digital humanists ally themselves with the activists, organizers, and others who are working to empower those most threatened by it? They then go on to list a number of projects that embody this kind of allyship, from hurricane mapping efforts to the Colored Conventions Project, which uses digital tools to bring the buried history of 19th century Black organizing to life. Interestingly, they also acknowledge the functionally differentiated character of modern society, insisting on the need to recognize how, quote, work within the digital humanities is enabled by larger social, political, and technological systems. Now, I confess I'm not entirely sure what to make of this scholarly activism from a systems theoretical perspective, and I'm introducing it here in the hope that we can take it up in our discussion. It does seem potentially productive to me, however, to approach it in terms of the framework of Luhmann's reflections on protest movements. Luhmann clearly has an ambivalent relationship to such movements, although Kai-Uwe Hellmann argues that his positive views become increasingly clear over time. On the one hand, he warns of the dangers of a resistance based entirely on, quote, abgelehnter Wertsetzungen, and describes protest communication in quite derogatory terms. Es ist nicht eine Beobachtung zweiter Ordnung in dem Sinne, dass man ernstlich die Strukturen, die bestimmte Beobachtungen und Beschreibungen in der Geldwirtschaft etwa erzeugen, seinerseits übernimmt und auf einer höheren Reflexionsstufe behandelt, sondern eine sehr moralisch getönte Kommunikation, die auch die Verantwortung sich selbst gar nicht zumutet, auf der anderen Seite einzusteigen, es dort besser zu machen. So that's the negative commentary. On the other hand, he credits protest movements with having a, quote, wichtige Funktion im Erzeugen von Aufmerksamkeit für vernachlässigte Probleme. In particular, those programs that are a consequence of functional differentiation. In his synopsis of Luhmann's position, Hellmann goes so far as to claim that social movements provide, quote, eine Selbstbeschreibung moderner Gesellschaft, wie sie sonst nicht zur Verfügung steht, wenn auch mit gravierenden Theoriedefiziten, end quote. Against this backdrop, one might see digital humanities as a form of protest movement within the educational system, one that, despite its theoretical deficits, offers a self-description that sheds valuable light on Dysfunktionen der Funktionssysteme. Such an interpretation, of course, runs directly counter to the common view that digital humanities only serves to accelerate the corporatization of the neoliberal university. But it also seems to me to be better supported by the evidence. In his contribution to the debates volume described previously, Brian Greenspan provides support for such an interpretation. Like a number of other commentators, he notes the unprecedented degree to which scholars and scholarship in digital humanities draw attention to the hidden support infrastructures that make our work possible. As he puts it, digital humanities is, quote, if anything, guilty of making all too visible the dirty gears that drive the scholarly machine along with the mechanic's maintenance bill, end quote. What he means is that more than any other recent development in humanities scholarship, digital humanities has revealed the complex web of dependencies, both human and material, that undergird the autopoiesis of the university system, or at least the system of academic scholarship. These include technological and social dependencies, the most significant of which is perhaps the dependency of scholarship on the, quote, often hidden work of students, librarians and archivists, programmers, techies, research and teaching assistants, and alt-act workers, end quote. Moreover, although digital humanities communication is undeniably moralisch getönt and thus often polarizing, it is also characterized by some of the elements of a second-order observation as described in the previous quotation. In a far more precise manner than is the case with the new formalism, these criticisms, the criticisms leveled in the name of digital humanities are often paired with specific demands for structural changes within the scientific system, rather than by vague system-transcending invocations of subjectivity. One can make a case, in other words, that digital humanities offers a self-description that was previously unavailable, but also avoids some of the negative characteristics that Luhmann identifies with protest movements. In thinking about the ethics of academic work, then, recent approaches in digital humanities seem promising on a number of levels, but they also return us to questions of autonomy. Debates in Digital Humanities is a work of scholarship published for scholarly consumption by the University of Minnesota Press. As such, it is an element in the scientific system. Its broadly activist orientation and the particular recommendations included in some essays, however, suggest a conception of scholarship that ignores or possibly denies the autonomy of functional systems. Moreover, the projects held up as models, such as the previously mentioned Colored Conventions project, cast themselves as hybrid forms that combine research, general education, and political intervention. Perhaps this self-understanding is naive, and one can make the case that this communication, like that of the new formalists, is yet another example of a self-generated irritation within the scientific system, one whose ultimate consequence will be nothing more than additional communication. But it seems to be more than this. It appears to gesture toward de-differentiation, a calling into question of functional differentiation as such that could have real consequences. At a minimum, the allocation of intellectual energies toward these efforts entails opportunity costs for the pursuit of knowledge, and one wonders whether second-order observation of the humanities threatens to crowd out the first-order observations of more traditional research. More consequentially, inasmuch as the digital humanities approach is constituted by morally tinged communication directed toward what Luhmann refers to as, quote, die Folgen der Strukturen des Systems selbst, it places the very integrity of the system under pressure, with consequences for its autonomy and autopoiesis that could be both unpredictable and explosive. So to conclude, the new formalism and digital humanities represent two dramatically different paradigms for thinking about the ethics of scholarship in North American literary and cultural studies. And I think systems theory can help us make sense of the potential and pitfalls of both. I recognize that in attempting to harness some of the broadest and most basic categories of that theory, my approach pushes against the grain of many recent appropriations of Luhmann in the humanities. As I mentioned at the outset, these have tended to focus on a more targeted approach, selecting out particular concepts and applying them to the analysis of specific texts or literary historical questions. These efforts have much to commend them, and they'll probably be a large part of our project. And I share the conviction, to give just one example, that Luhmann's conception of the medium-form distinction can shed new light on substantive literary theoretical debates. The same can be said for his claims about the function of art, that it communicates, quote, ein anderes, nicht normales, irritierendes Verhältnis von Wahrnehmung und Kommunikation, end quote. But I also think there's a strong case to be made for returning to some of Luhmann's original insights and placing them in the service of a metacritique. Insights into the operative autonomy of functional systems, the contingency of intersystem relations, and the need for adequately complex descriptions of both. The reason, as I think I've made clear, is the discrepancy I see between the intensity with which North American literary and cultural studies scholars invoke ethical goals and their interest in engaging seriously with the possibility of realizing those goals. It strikes me as something of a paradox, though maybe not in the Luhmannian sense, that the discipline is deeply preoccupied with complexity in all its forms except this one. To be sure, the consequences of a systems theoretical elucidation of this particular form of complexity would be fairly modest, perhaps resulting only in what Luhmann refers to in another context as the elimination of, quote, viele leichtgängige Irrtümer, end quote. But it would be a good start. Thanks very much.